to hear her participation. Okay, go, it's bad now.
I'm talking about, today I'm going to talk about microlending. What is microlending? I'm going to read this definition. Is from the internet. It's a microlending, that extension of very small loans, microloans, to the unemployed and poor and the other living in poverty that are not considered bankable. These people lack collaterals, steady employment, and verifiable credit history, and therefore cannot meet even the most minimal qualification to gain access to traditional credits and get additional money to finance their small business, like this woman from Syria and this from South Africa. So basically, this microloans is like to give like poor people the opportunity to.
What is the minimum and the maximum that constitutes a microloan?
There is no minimum. It depends on how much you want to loan, but there are some websites like Kiva. It's like $25, and the maximum. When I saw the statistics, it was like the median was about $300, and it depends on how much you want. You can.
Does anybody ever get like $1,000?
Yeah. Some got more than 1,000.
Okay.
But it depends on how many people will get, like in Kiva. How it works, non-profit companies and sometimes for-profit companies lend small amount of money to poor people to start a business that help them increase their income, and small amount of interest is charged to help this company. It's not like big interest like banks, usual banks. It's small interest just to cover the company expenses and the administrative work and stuff. Here's an example. Is Kiva. It's a non-profit organization that give microlending. Their way of doing it is there is in each city and countries there is a field partner of Kiva that identify people who are a good candidate for the microlending and lists them in their website. So anyone needs, he should report to the field partner. Then customers like us can view the profiles on the website, and they can loan money as little as $25 and increasing in $25 increments. As a lender, you can pick which person you want to lend through the website. You can see what they want the money for, what are their project, and what is like when, for example, you will get your money. For example, there is like a period of time, and you can like do your homework on that. See if there's like, because sometimes the person is not worth it, to give, because you feel that this business is not like stable. So these are some of the cons of these. As the person pays the loan back, you are paid back as well. You would then have the option to withdraw your money, or apply it in another loan, or donate it to Kiva to cover operating expenses. Here's some statistic on Kiva. Total amount of loans purchased made through Kiva is 354 million. Number of Kiva users about 1,266,000 persons. Number of Kiva users who have funded a loan is 826. Number of borrowers in Kiva is 867. Number of loans that have been funded through Kiva, 473. Percentage of Kiva borrowers who are women is 81%. Usually, like micro lending, like people give more to women than men. While I was reading about microlending, and when I saw this, that's like proof that like more women are like available for micro lending and the proof because they are highly rated to give back the loan more than men. So here is a proof that it's 81 of 100. Although I think men also pay, but I don't know, like 6 as well. Number of Kiva field partners is 167. Number of countries is 64. And current repayment rate is 98%. So 99%. So there is a really high repayment rate on this website. Average loan size, good question, is $398. And average total amount loaned per Kiva users is 279. And the average number of loans per Kiva user is 8.6. So it's about 7 times the
If I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. All of the countries where the loans are made are low and middle income countries?
Mostly third world countries, but there are some in the U.S. too. But that's why that's why sometimes the micro lending is not enough for these countries like Europe, like United States, because $25 can do a lot in like an African or like Middle Eastern country, but in the U.S. $25
barely gets you lunch.
Yeah. So.
And when did this start? This Kiva thing?
2005, I think.
Where did it originate, the idea?
I'm not sure, but I think in the U.S., but I'm not sure. But
Do you know what Kiva means?
No. But, yeah, but...
Okay, forgive me for interrupting. I'm just
no,
very
it's
curious.
okay. No,
Go
but I need to look at that. What is some of pros is trying to encourage self-sufficiency. Sufficiency and in poverty, start successful business, repay loan eventually, and raise income status dramatically. And microlending isn't actually charity. It's a big amount of the money is doing exactly what you want to do, and then being returned is better than a conventional charity can offer. Like, when you give charity, you don't know where your money is going to. But in this, like you chose the person that you want to give him the money. So even if it's lending, so you're accepting that your money is getting back. So if you lose your money, it's like, you already gave it to charity. So you don't think, about losing the money. And here is some example of women in Bolivia have a grocery shop, and here they in Africa they use I think they have farm supplies like cows to do the things. What are some cons? Loan amount may need to be higher in countries with a higher cost of living. In some cases, people don't pay their loans back. Another thing is some people do end up borrowing from more than one agency and then using loans from one agency to repay the other agency. It might discourage government from either developing or keeping programs designed to help the very poor. And microlending agency has lower regulation than with any government lending program do. So a tendency to abuse the system or do saving loans can exist because they cannot go after that, like the government. For profit banks...
Who regulates microlending? Does anybody regulate it?
No, the company itself put the rules. So that's why sometimes
They sort of self-regulate, but they can't regulate in every country where they have the field operator.
Yeah, and sometimes the field operator will go bankrupt or use the money for different things. So,
but I just want to state for the record, that can happen with any bank.
Yeah.
And the banks that don't do microloans, the banks that really come, you know, the too big to fail banks, and Bank of America, I mean, those people, when they were ripping off and being abusing with stuff, they weren't dealing with a couple $1 million, you know, they were doing the pretty big kind.
And another thing is for-profit banks and companies that give microloan often charge higher fees than non-profit micro lending.
Is Kiva a nonprofit?
It is.
Okay, see, I think that's a great thing, whenever, and we're gonna discuss the
I
pros
like
and
Kiva.
cons.
I was thinking, you know, to like,
Oh,
not invest,
you
you know,
convinced
do.
me, you
Yeah.
have totally convinced
Kiva
me,
is-
I'm
is-
going
is
to
like-
make an investment. I'm
It's
gonna
also
find
nice that in $25 increments, even someone like me,
Yeah.
who cannot normally help people,
Yeah,
you
and,
know.
and the good thing is you choose. You know, you go to the profile and you know, you see the people, I went and you have like a picture of the person and what he wants to do and the money that he needs to do. And you
You
know,
talked me into it, and I think nonprofits really do have some controls, you know? Most countries, not all countries, but most countries have some level of control over nonprofits, and
yeah.
so.
That's why most of, like, when I went, like, look around on micro lending companies, most of them, like, lend to women, not to men, because they tend to repay more than men. So,
Don't feel bad, Ben.
I'm throwing
I
off
have
that
a comment on
statistic.
that,
I
but
never
after
repay.
he finished.
Hmm?
I have a comment on this point, but after he finished, I don't wanna.
You
Sure.
We
yeah,
can,
you can.
this is a good time for you to
Yeah,
make
shoot.
your comment.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Kiva is part of, I don't know if you heard about social entrepreneurship movement in the
Yes.
world.
Uh-huh.
So they're trying to do for-profit business that is sustainable. So
Mhm.
those people are has the what is it called, the ownership of their business, and at the same time, in those less developed countries, women are the what is it called, the main supplier of the house. And I think the statistics showed that, I'm not very sure about the percentage, but in one of the African countries, if the woman died while giving birth, I think the percentage that the probability of her baby survived after 1 year is like 3% or 4%, because women are the main provider of the house in those countries, especially that men are born in those wars and disasters, and they're not settled
And
countries.
even when they're not having disasters and things, those guys have much more luck getting work outside in cities and far away, and they live in barracks. Even if there isn't a war, there's so much more mobility for men. They have more opportunities for wage earning, and they contribute to the household a far lower proportion
Yeah.
of the income that they have. Nothing personal.
No,
But-
nothing personal, but it's this that shows that women are the main providers in many African countries, especially because of the wars. But even as you said, men are more mobile. They go far. They emigrate from the small villages. So and women stay with their kids, and they don't have contraceptives, so they have a lot of kids, and etc. So they are the main providers. That's why they are the main people.
They usually work more than men in farms and like.
Yeah,
and
they're farmers, a lot of farmers there, so that's why they're more to have loans than.
No, but usually they pay back their
And they pay
loans
back,
more than.
because they
yeah.
work.
Yeah, no, but like even men, but I don't know, like maybe they're abusing the system more, or maybe, it's not maybe, but women are more honest. Yeah, so it's, I see. So, thank you, and there is a funny video on Kiva, shows how it works, if you want to.
Please, let's just take a second to watch it. This is an important issue in community organization, right now, it is a very popular place to start. And while he gets that together, in our organization, in helping Healing Hands in the Dominican Republic, we were not allowed to loan money, but we were able to give grants. That's what, and people would open little businesses because they could not get work because they had HIV and there was a lot of discrimination. Okay, on with the show.
Together, they run a small family business, farming coffee beans, just like the ones you're drinking now. Pedro used to have 2 cows that helped him plow a field. One of the cows died of old age. That means Pedro can only plow half the amount he used to. That means Pedro can only sell half the amount of coffee beans he used to, and his income has been cut in half. Pedro now has just barely enough money to feed his family, and can't afford to buy a new cow. This is Kiva. Kiva is a website where people like you can lend money to people like Pedro. Say you decide to lend $25. Your $25 goes from you to Kiva to a microfinance institution near Pedro and is used to fund a small part of a loan that they've made to Pedro. When 100 people like you all lend $25, the loan is fully funded. With this loan, Pedro can buy a tractor and grow 10 times as many coffee beans as he did before. Pedro can repay his loan to you in no time. Once you get your money back, you can choose to relend it to someone else on Kiva or withdraw your money. And as simple as that, you've helped a family halfway around the world, and it didn't cost you a dime.
Thank you very much. Any additional comments or questions for Bandar?
Have a nice day.
Okay, please go ahead.
I took a course with a social entrepreneurship course, elective, and the professor, when she told us that when she knew about Kiva, she made like a homework for her kids. She asked everyone to lend just $25, and they choose the one who wants to give the money, and it was really like a family exercise, but it taught them a lot. That's it.
It taught them a lot.
Yeah, taught the kids a lot.
So this is their website, and here you can see the people that you want to lend money. So like Lydia Maria from Colombia, she needs a loan for $1,100. So now they raise 2% of her loan. You can help, in 25 or whatever amount you want, and that's, will increase, like everyone will lend, it will increase, then she will get her loan. Here is
Can you pick a country?
uh,
Could you pick a country?
I think we need to do it yesterday, but let's see. Country.
It's okay. I'm going to fool around with it when I get home. Thank you very much. I definitely, you have piqued my interest.
And here too is the repayment terms, repayment schedule, monthly, fee listed in this way, and if you have like currency exchange loss, it's possible.
She's already gotten the loan. You're just backfilling the loan.
Yeah, and here is,
Where does it say that?
It's there. It says, your funds will be used to backfill this loan. Repayments will go to you.
and here you have like repayment schedule. You can see the schedule here, and here you can they have lender comments if she abused or if she's a good person, you can write any comments here.
Okay. Thank you so much. Don't forget to send us.
I have to get it from my email or your email. because I don't have the USB drive.
Okay, there, get it from your email, there's an
Okay.
email there. Carlos, do you have your presentation?
No, I didn't bring it today.
You
I
didn't?
think you can.
No, I didn't bring
Don't
it.
you have it online? Do you have it online?
No, I have it in the USB and I didn't bring the USB.
Okay, does anybody else have a presentation for today? Do you?
You can.
I can
Okay,
give
you
one
have
to
to-
Dominican Republic.
No, that's okay. You have to bring it next week,
Yeah,
Carlos,
I'm
okay?
sorry. I
It's
was
okay,
gonna
it's
ask you if I can bring it next week.
Okay, it's okay. Anybody else have a presentation today? Do you do the action?
No.
Oh, I forgot to tell you, anybody that gives these ad hoc presentations gets 5 points towards their final grade.
What do you mean ad hoc? Like,
They're not the final presentation that
Presentation.
everybody takes.
so these are not, so that one wasn't the final,
No, that was not the final.
Do we volunteer to do so, or you
Of
assign
course.
us to do so?
Of course you volunteered to do so. Did I force, you didn't get the impression that I forced you.
No, I
guys.
mean,
They-
no, I don't mean
They
that.
sort of, I mean, of course, there was some subtle pressure, but they did express interest in doing it. Okay, shoot.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to present on Professor Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank, which is a form of microcredit that Banga kind of address generally. So this gentleman is Muhammad Yusuf, and this is the headquarters of the Grameen Bank at Chittagong in Bangladesh. So a little about the professor. This is his address, his email ID and website in case anyone wants to contact. He is a PhD in economics from USA, and he has had a number of scholarships from Fulbright scholarship and a lot of other stuff. Here are just a few of them. So a brief history of the Grameen Bank. In 1976, Professor Yunus was then the head of the Rural Economics program at University of Chittagong, Bangladesh. He launched an action research project to examine the possibility of designing a credit delivery system to provide banking services targeted at rural poor. So it was basically something like poor, he was well known among the poor people or among the rural people in that area. And sometimes people used to come because he was known as a kind-hearted person, asking for some money to borrow, to lend them some money. And that's how that idea came into his mind, that if we can lend some money and they can use it in constructive purposes, then later they can repay the loan and also it can come to their own uses. So just from his own experiences, the whole idea of Grameen Bank came out. So the word Grameen means rural in Bangla or Bengali language, which is the national language of Bangladesh. I mean, it's also one of the languages in India, because in India we have a lot of language, and my mother tongue is Bengali. So
How many languages do you speak?
3. In English and Hindi is the national language of India, and Bengali.
I heard, sorry, I heard that India have like more than 2,000 languages, right?
Maybe, I am not sure of the
Yeah.
count, but if you include all the tribal languages and all that stuff, maybe.
Yeah.
how many languages does the average person know?
I guess 2 or 3, not more than that, because there is a lot of diversity. Like there are, like you know Dr. Madhivanan, right?
Yes.
She is from southern part of India, and her language, I think she knows more languages than me. She knows 5 or 6 languages probably. So her languages are totally different from what we speak. So I can't understand a single word of what her mother tongue is. It's that different.
Gotcha.
So that was the beginning of this Grameen Bank project. The objectives of the Grameen Bank project were to extend banking facilities to poor men and women, eliminate the exploitation of the poor by money lenders, because although nowadays officially money lending means, unofficial money lending, not from banks, but we have the age-old custom that some very rich people used to give money lend money to the poor and used to charge exorbitant rates of interest.
Have you ever heard of credit cards?
Yeah. Shark loans, loan
Yeah,
sharks.
Loan
yeah,
sharks.
shark
Loan
loans.
There are
sharks,
loan
yeah.
sharks everywhere. They have
Yeah.
those places where you say,
Yeah.
you see check cashing, or they give you a loan based on
Yeah,
your
there's payday
on
loans. where
payday
they-
loans. Just go in there as an exercise in community organization and see how much they want to charge in interest.
It's outrageous. We live
It's
right,
unbelievable.
I live in a
It's
very low
unbelievable.
income place in Alabama, very poor area. They have them all over the place. And we went into one because we needed money, and it was ridiculous. It was like
It was worse
more,
than a
more
credit
than
card.
even a credit card, and credit cards are ridiculous.
Oh, carry on.
So basically, it wants to eliminate the exploitation of the poor by money lenders so that people don't have to go to the money lenders. Create opportunities for self-employment for the vast multitude of unemployed people in rural Bangladesh, in countries like Bangladesh, India, and these kind of so-called developing countries. There are a huge percentage of unemployment, so they can start something of their own. Bring the disadvantaged, mostly the women, as Bandar said, from the poorest households within the fold of an organizational format which they can understand and manage by themselves. And reverse the age-old vicious cycle of low income, no saving and low investment into a virtuous circle. I mean, I love those terms, like reverse the age-old vicious circle into a virtuous circle of low income, injection of credit, investment, more income, more savings, more investment, more income. So I think that says it all. Now the project becomes a bank. The action research project was successful. It demonstrated strength in the few villages in Chittagong district. Support of the central bank and the nationalized, the Central Bank of Bangladesh and the nationalized commercial banks also supported this project to extend to another district and thereafter to several other districts of the country. And in 1983, government legislation transformed it into an independent bank. And presently, the Grameen Bank is owned by rural poor. Borrowers own 90% of the shares and remaining 10% is owned by the government. Now, I don't want to go into microcredit because Bandar has already covered it. Just that microcredit summit was held from 2nd to 4th February 1997 in Washington, D.C. It is the small loans to very poor people, micro-entrepreneurs for self-employment project that generate income, allowing them to care for themselves and their families, and also for community use. The terms and conditions are flexible and easy to understand, not very complicated like of the usual banks, and suited to the local conditions of the community. Now if we compare the Grameen versus conventional banks, in conventional bank the principle is the more you have, the more you get. While in Grameen Bank, the credit is a human right. Everyone should get credit. The highest priority for a conventional bank is for those who have the maximum, and for the Grameen Bank, for those who have nothing. Conventional bank is usually based on collateral, it is collateral free. Conventional bank looks at what has already been acquired by a person, and Grameen Bank looks at the potential waiting to be unleashed in a person, even the poorest. Conventional banks are owned by the rich, generally men, common in urban areas, and they are just the opposite, owned by poor rural women. There is a punishment mode, in the form of fines or huge interest if delay or unable to repay. But in Grameen Bank, they are called defaulters, and it is one of the responsibilities of the Grameen system to help them or to assist the people to find out why they are not able to repay the loans, and so that they can reschedule the loans and repay them later. Another very interesting thing is the whole chapter of compound interest in math books is largely because of the banks. Because the conventional banks follow compound interest, while in Grameen Bank is simple interest. So one need not worry so much about how long he is repaying it. Conventional bank is only money oriented, and Grameen Bank encourages borrowers for 16 decisions. Now this is another very interesting thing. I didn't go into this detail, but when a borrower borrows money from a Grameen Bank, he automatically kind of agrees, or he is explained that he has to follow 16 decisions. So these 16 decisions are very applicable to countries like Bangladesh, like I will not accept dowry, I will not kill a girl child, and all these are very humanistic and very socially acceptable messages. So this is kind of a binding between the borrower and the bank. So for all this, the Nobel Peace Prize was owned by by Professor, and in 2006 it was divided into 2 equal parts to Dr. Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank. Please note that I had this misconception for a long time that he won the Nobel Prize for economics, but he won it for peace, for their efforts to create economic and social development from below.
I was completely, that's the first I've heard of that. I was completely confused. I thought
Yeah,
it was
I knew
like
about
for
this a few
economics.
months
Because he's
ago.
an economist, so just kind of
I
automatically.
knew about this a few months ago from a friend of Bangladesh. I also thought always that he was won it from economics. These are some of the sources. And lastly, I would like to end by the concept of Muhammad Yunus. To me, poor people are like bonsai trees. Bonsai trees are the small forms of big trees. When you plant the best seed of the tallest tree in a flower pot, you get a replica of the tallest tree only inches tall. Poor people are bonsai people. There is nothing wrong in their seeds. Simply, society never gave them the base to grow on. All it needs to get the poor people out of poverty for us is to create an enabling environment for them. Once the poor can unleash their energy and creativity, poverty will disappear very quickly. That was part of his Nobel lecture.
That was very inspiring. Don't forget to send your
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah, sure.
Do you know where we could see a list of all 16 of the,
Yeah. You can just search Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank. In this, if I send this PowerPoint, let me show it.
no, it's, I mean,
Here it is, this link.
It's okay. We can actually, I'm sure that we can get
Yeah,
to all of those
you can
sources.
easily find it. And if I find it, I will.
Thank you so much. And
Yeah, I like how they use the, it's like, it's a win-win situation, like they win, like, have them like increase their income, plus, eliminate some of the bad habits that, in these cultures.
wow, it is so amazing. It
Yeah.
made my imagination. I had no idea about those
Yeah.
things. I really
Even
learned
I
a
didn't.
lot today
Yeah.
from.
I mean, when I read about this, it made more sense to me that he won the Nobel Prize for peace.
Yes.
Yeah.
He has done a lot. I mean, to just get people to pledge not to kill girl children, that is such a step. Because people think that's unconnected to poverty, and it is totally connected to poverty. That's how poverty proliferates. Anna, you came just in time. Let's do it. Now, Anna's going to introduce my presentation for today. Anna has been reviewing one of our recommended texts, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If that word sounds weird to you, it's because it's actually just forced translate from Portuguese, the pedagogia, or in Spanish, pedagogía, the type of teaching for the oppressed. And on with the show. Just, do you have your?
Yeah, I put it here, but it's not working.
Okay. Here.
Removable? Is it removable disc?
Yeah, that's the one.
Did you see your movement?
Yeah. Yay, that must be it, you see? Yeah. I have technical difficulty with my printers, but I have my oh,
All right. Okay, let's do it.
F5.
Go ahead and do slideshow.
that is what I like to do.
Or F5.
Slideshow. That's it. That's it. Slideshow. From the beginning.
And then just
Up, 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 up.
Yeah, let's just give it a second. Okay, that's not what I wanted to see.
Just go from the beginning. From beginning, go left, upper left-hand corner.
You can press F5.
F5. Yeah. No, F5. The keyboard.
Yay! Brava. Okay, let's do it.
Okay, Jesus, sorry.
Did you just say
I
our
said it.
Lord's name?
Your lords, Mom. Maybe not anyone else's.
Because I have what I wanted to do, but what I wanted to do is get at the same time my
Don't worry
lecture.
about it. Don't,
Because I
To,
wanted,
to read out
uh-huh.
from it?
don't, you cannot do it. You cannot do it. Just relax and just
See if
converse
I
with
remember.
us
Okay.
and tell us about this man. Go ahead and do your PowerPoint presentation.
I'm trying to.
You cannot do them both at the same time.
You could pull it up on a different,
Yeah.
That's what I
different,
wanted
you
to
can pull
do.
it up on his laptop and you can read off that.
Yeah,
Oh, mine, yeah.
turning
No,
on.
never mind.
You
This
have
is
yours?
why God invented note cards, y'all.
But her printer
Keep
wasn't.
rejecting.
I can't think right now.
Back in my day, printers were called writing, Mom.
Yes. Writing. Yes. That was before printers. Back in the 20th century, we also had books.
Okay, Paulo Freire, he was a Brazilian educator
F5.
and is almost
Just click on the beginning. On the beginning. Click from the beginning. Okay, right
F5.
click from the beginning. You see where it says from beginning and in the left upper left hand corner right under file. Yay! That one. Okay.
okay, and he was one of the most influential educational thinkers of the late 20th century. He was born in Recife, Brazil, on October 1921, and died of the
Only
same
our mother could
birthday
tell
of
us apart. Only our,
1921, Mom?
Yeah,
I'm just
just no.
that's why I have this long white beard.
And
1921.
he died of a heart failure in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in May 2nd, 1997. After a brief career as a lawyer, he taught Portuguese in secondary schools from 1941 to 47, and he consequently became the first director of the Department of Cultural Extensions of the University.
You skipped a
Recife.
bullet there. You skipped the bullet. That was very important. After his brief career as a lawyer, he actually became very active in adult education. Oh, go ahead.
And he's also, consequently after, teaching in these schools, he became active in adult education and workers training. And then is when he became the director of the cultural extension of the University of Recife. In 1969, he was a visitor scholar of Harvard University. And then he moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where he assumed the role of a special educational advisor to the World Congress of Churches. For his most well-known work, most well-known work is Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is when he wrote it in 1970. And throughout his subsequent books, he argues for a system of education that emphasizes learning as an act of culture and freedom. And he is also well known for concepts such as praxis, which is defined in our book as the interaction between reflection and the actions that people take to promote individual and community change. Also, another concept is banking education, in which passive learners have pre-selected knowledge deposited in their minds. And conscientization, which the doctor said came from the Portuguese conscientización, a process by which the learner advances towards critical consciousness.
How do they have pre-selected knowledge deposited into their minds?
Haven't you ever been in a schoolroom and this is what we do still after so many years. People sit in desks and stuff is poured into them in a very passive way. And it is a very reactionary way to teach and a very reactionary way to learn. And he was one of the people that opened the door to a completely different way of approach to education.
Another concept that he also mentioned is the culture of silence, in which dominated individuals lose the means by which critically respond to the culture that is forced on them by dominant culture. And other important concepts, could be, dialectic, empowerment, liberatory education, humanization, mystification, problematization, and so on. And if you're interested in getting more, these concepts and the glossary, you can find it in that website, the Tom Waited site. That's, it's very interesting to see, all those definitions. There were issues when, in the Freudian pedagogy literature training in northern Brazil, following the military coup d'etat on, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Coup d'etat.
Coup d'etat of 1964, and he was jailed by the government and eventually forced to be exiled to a political exile that lasted 15 years. He returned to Brazil in 1979. And Freud developed developed his philosophies in 1950 over extremely effective learning programs for favelas, or slums, occupants and laborers. He selected expressively and communally stimulating words and depictions of students' difficulties to create debates about how they can improve their lives. And the Freudian model, is a series of cycles that goes listening, dialogue, action, reflection cycle, and it's a series of stages conducting to learning and behavior change. The various didactic ideas have been promoters for global programs in learning, worker health and safety, union education, English as a second language, health education, youth programs, public establishment with populations such as the homeless, and a community improvement progress. For his rationale of education was human freedom, implying that individuals are subjects of their own wisdom or education, and not hollow containers or receptacles filled with educators' knowledge. He recommended also a structural dialogue approach, which is the same concept of the different series. The dialogue approach encourages students and a subject where each person contributes as a co-learners to form an equally implicit reality. And through dialogue, people participate in conscientization or critical reflection to examine the social perspective for their own problems and own role in solving those difficulties. The objective of the practice, which by definition is the constant interaction between reflection and the actions that people take to encourage individual and community changes. In health education, social work, and community organizing, there have been growing interest in the role of Freudian theory to in health enhancement, with the goal of helping people collectively to move beyond feelings of powerlessness and assume control over their lives. There are other didactic ideas that have been mentioned in the book too, which his didactic ideas promote global programming in learning such as working health and safety, union education, youth programs, and organizing with populations and community development. Thank you very much. Is there any questions?
I really appreciated your presentation. I just want you to know that this is a very powerful method. It changed my life, and it's changed many, many lives. The reason why people who have used this method go to jail is not because they're committing a crime. It's because this type of education changes people. It changes people, and they are correct to be afraid of it. All dictatorships are afraid of this type of education, and they're very careful to monitor it and try to crush it when it emerges. Any comments or questions for Anna before I share my presentation?
I tried to summarize as much as I could from the book, and there are a lot of websites that you can, like Freudian projects, HCMMA. A lot of universities mention him all the time because his global programs have helped a lot of students and professors too. And so
it's a very transforming thing. I mean, he was like a before Freire, after Freire, in terms of any kind of education. He changed education of adults a lot. And sometimes when you hear these things that are supposed to be relatively newfangled things like for adult learners and stuff like that, it turns out what they're doing is using Freudian approaches. And yes. Your auntie what?
My aunt's dog just died.
Oh,
She's just
sorry.
going crazy right now.
Okay. Just do your thing. I have feel called to recall the experiences that I have had in learning as an adult and moving both as a learner and as a co-learner with my young colleagues in the institutions where I have taught. I have had the experience of seeing and actually doing the best and the worst of education, including that very oppressive education. Okay, I'm going to actually go through this in an anaerobic way, because my understanding is that you've had this for a little while, so I could just go anaerobically through this, meaning say I'm not going to draw a breath, I'm going to go fast. Okay, because I want to get to the important part of this session. Okay, this is a fact. Okay, all education and training is transformational. It's preparing people to fit preparing them for their place in society, whether it's your place as a creator or your place as a slave. That's what education is for. It's preparatory. Okay? It's either as a slave or an owner or a liberator or a free being. That's the transformational element in education and training. You recall when we were talking last week about the demonstrations in South Africa of the children that wanted to learn English. They didn't want to just learn Afrikaans, because all of the literature that was written in Afrikaans was written by white South Africans. And it was very, very restrictive of them, while English opened the doors to a whole new world. And for that they sacrificed their sacrifice of life. And many people sacrifice to learn to be free. It's also, all education is ideological. It has an ideological component. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's more subtle. It's always there. And that ideology is either enslaving or liberating or somewhere kind of in the middle, but it always has an ideology. And you know that in public health, we have ideologies. We definitely have ideologies. Now, it's in relation. All education and training is in relation to the status quo. It's either supporting the status quo, defying the status quo, in a kind of ambiguous relationship with the status quo, but it's always related to the status quo. And finally, all education is marked with the stamp of class consciousness. And again, when you're in it, either as a student or even as an educator, this can be very subtle. It can be even missed. But for an outsider, it's very clear usually when you're looking in at the training. For example, people who have been raised in Catholic schools, they generally don't notice until somebody comes in from the outside, or until they leave that type of training, that the world is very, very varied. And the stamp of class that education has is to either support the permanence of division or to struggle against these divisions among the classes. Now, all health education, particularly health education, but education as a whole, just the way it can be oppressive, it can also be very liberating. And very early on during slavery, there were laws that were passed to restrict teaching slaves, particularly to write, but also to read. And all New World liberation struggles, from Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas, through slavery abolition, through the literacy and transforming education of Freire, have been typified by that education for liberation component. In the United States, throughout the post-Reconstruction period in the South and in Latin America and the Caribbean, they have always used what they call literacy laws and poll taxes to keep the poor from voting, because there's too many of them. Now, in this country, there used to be up during the time when I was young, when I was a teenager, they still had states where they would have what they called literacy laws. And if a white person was going to vote, they just assumed that they could read. But the literacy laws for African Americans where they would have to like recite the Constitution from memory. That was their proof of literacy. And they actually, the hilarious thing about this is that people really wanted to vote. So they did it. So they actually had kids, college kids, go down south during the summer and teach people how, just drill them on.
The funny thing is, pretty sure I couldn't recite the Constitution. In fact, I'm 100% positive.
Oh, no, nobody.
And I'm definitely literate.
Nobody could do this. And now, of course, we see some of that happening right now with these, they focus just on states that are called swing states, where it's not clear which way the state is going to go. And then they restrict voting for the poorer people by having like all these restrictions, like this form of ID, that it has to be this kind of picture on it. And those things serve exactly the same purpose. It's a way of keeping people from voting. Now the roots, and does not have to, I'm not suggesting in any way that I think Fidel Castro is a good guy, or was ever a good guy, or that anybody should be in power for 50 years. Hello, I'm totally not suggesting this. But the roots of the literacy campaigns of the late 1950s and early 1960s were really exemplified in Cuba. This is something that I lived through. I was an eyewitness. I was the youngest literacy volunteer in Santiago, and I wrote composition about it. My parents didn't let me go.
There's a shocker.
all the kids wrote essays about our role in literacy training for adults that could not read or write, and mine got the award, but I was not allowed to actually volunteer for alphabetization. That's another story. Now, I want you to note, these are photographs taken of people doing this thing, these kids, these young people, going to the communities in Cuba, mostly rural Cuba. This was when the literacy rate was very low. It was around 50%. And doing this type of literacy training, alfabetización literally means literacy training.
Now, approximately what is the literacy rate?
Oh, in adults, well, this is 50 years later, it's well over 95%. And anybody in Cuba who's an adult who does not read or write is usually has an intellectual disability. Because, let me put it this way, education in Cuba is free and it's compulsory. And the compulsory with all caps and bolds. I mean, you really have to stay in school. Okay, now the alphabetization.
What do they do to you if you don't?
Huh? They literally lock you up. You know, just how they used to do here with what
Because they
call
have truant
truants?
officers here, but then I hear about people like, I have relatives that, they're like, oh, well, dropped out of school.
Well,
in high school.
let me say this about that. In the Dominican Republic, it's the same way. It's supposed to be compulsory education. But everybody knows that if every kid that was entitled to free education, public education in the Dominican Republic decided to show up at the school where they were, where they belonged, and the whole system would break down. I mean, it depends. There just isn't enough funding or enough support for that system to actually provide education for everybody. And something very similar happens in the United States. The people that should be in charge of looking at absenteeism and that kind of thing have some motive to be pretty relaxed in some cases, because it really, the facilities that they have, it's not that the teachers are striking so that they can have, vacations in the Riviera. The conditions of inner city schools are really unreal. And it would be, for people doing public health, it is it would be very useful for us to actually explore that, because I am almost 99.9% sure that none of us here have the imagination to think that this is happening in Miami, Florida. I'm going to tell you right now, you don't have that much imagination. You got to see it. You got to see it to believe it. Okay, the literacy campaign was mostly conducted by students training the urban and rural poor, and the teachers were aged from 12 to about 20-something, and most were not trained as teachers. They were trained in Freudian kind of teaching. They had very few textbooks, and it was very ideological. It was intended to break barriers. There was something very powerful about having 12-year-olds teaching old people to write. That's a very, very powerful thing. It's something that, to a certain degree, in a tiny little way, we try to keep alive by having students present and teach with the professors in the class. Okay, it was among the barriers. You see that picture above? It's an Afro-Cuban girl in her uniform teaching an illiterate adult who is obviously of European ancestry. In Cuba in the 50s, that was amazing. That was an amazing, amazing thing to have. It was much more amazing even than the 12-year-old child teaching the 50-year-old man. This was ideological, putting into people's heads that African American people can not only learn, but they can teach white people. So it was a couple of summers that this lasted. From 1961 through the 1990s, literacy training has been very, very controversial, lots of fighting words. Now in Brazil and Argentina, there's a lot of repression, a lot of exiles like Paulo Freire. But in El Salvador, Honduras, Chile, Uruguay, the right-wing regimes targeted these are literacy teachers who have been executed. Those are extrajudicial executions, which were in several countries, particularly El Salvador. They would have squads of semi-formally affiliated people with people who were affiliated with the government in an informal way, who would they would basically terrorize people that were trying to obtain literacy training by murdering anybody who did this kind of work and leaving their body to
That's in Honduras, you said? El Salvador? Oh my
Now that
God.
was in El Salvador. And there's Paulo Freire and his historic book. Now,
Sorry, they're murdering the teachers or the students?
they would murder the teachers, but it was a way of actually giving the message to people that they didn't need to be hanging, or those people were very dangerous.
Oh, okay.
You know, I don't know why I laugh at this, but in Guatemala, there was this priest who was from Italy, and he was doing literacy training, and he was asked to stop, and it was like, he just didn't get it. And they took him for interrogation, and they broke his jaw during the questioning. And so he could only drink things, and he was a really cool guy. And he was saying, can you imagine doing this to an Italian? I have to go 6 months without eating pasta. I mean, he was a very special person, but they really didn't feel like they could kill him or disappear him, because he was a foreigner, and he had papers. It was absolutely unthinkable to kill that person. But to the thousands of people who were disappeared, there were many people, many literacy workers that were not left as an example. They were actually disappeared. They were to be taken for questioning, and they would never return. Now, the new vocabulary of education was to use these concepts were very, very powerful. because that culture of silence is actually something that we internalize, and it's almost like a bad habit. We don't even notice that we're doing it, just like other bad habits. And it's the socially dispossessed actually internalize the negative images of themselves that are created by the oppressors in situations of extreme poverty. And they almost start looking at themselves the same way the oppressive society looks at them. So that they end up actually doing part of the work of the oppressive society by just internalizing it. And the silence is, they don't speak for themselves. They allow the oppressive society to define them and to speak for them, and they just don't even have the language to resist. Now, conscientization is a reaction. We call it critical consciousness. Consciousness means like being aware, okay? And when you start being aware, what that means is you start actually questioning, is this right? Does this make sense that all of us are in this situation? Does that make sense? Does that make sense that I get charged an interest rate of 25% or 30% to cash a check? Does that make sense? Is that fair? Is fairness an issue? Do I have a right to do that? And you know, when the oppressors start talking about the oppressed as kind of like mocking them and saying they feel like they're victims, they feel like they're entitled to everything. And the truth is, conscientization is actually waking up to the fact that yes, they are victims, and yes, they're entitled to the same rights, including credit, not just health and housing and literacy and the vote and credit. It's a big leap. That big leap, when you actually start recognizing what's going on, is called conscientization, because you become conscious. Praxis is based on the same word that practice is. It's a skill that's enacted or practiced, that's realized, and the basic principle of this form of education is intergenerational equity. I not only look like I'm 30 years old, that was a joke, but there is equality in the system. Okay, that's how it works. Now, there's this very good film, and I'm going to show a clip of it. Not today because we're running a little short, but it actually has the book is even better than the film because
I didn't know it was a book.
Oh my God! Yes,
It's called Push.
It's called Push?
Push by Sapphire. Push, and in Push, Push is written by a woman who's a literacy trainer and who does this kind of Freirean literacy training with very underserved young women in Harlem, in New York City. But the interesting thing about the book, which was based on this fictional character who's based on many, many real characters, is that they actually had the kids writing as she developed her consciousness, her conscientization. So anyway, this type of education encourages the oppressed to see themselves in completely new terms. First of all, becoming aware of their oppression and then becoming outraged. And then they promote the student, young, unempowered, as teacher, empowered. And then they go through this process that includes dialogue and practice. And one of the health promotion programs that are based on Freirean education approaches is the Adolescent Social Action Program, or ASAP. It's empowerment education, community organization, strategies incorporating this type of educational theory, moving from dialogue and praxis, through praxis. and then Ronald Rogers' protection, motivation, behavior change theory, which I'm sure that you have heard about. The goals of ASAP were to reduce morbidity and mortality in very high-risk environments and to encourage healthier choices through empowerment, education, active engagement in political and social action. And this was a 7-week experience for small groups of youth, and they were brought into hospitals, detention centers to talk to people living with drug addiction, alcohol, violence, and HIV. And these facilitators followed a curriculum of structured dialogue about people's stories. And there were exercises in decision-making and communication. And here's how the cycle goes. You can start anywhere in the cycle. Many times you can start with dialogue, but dialogue implies listening. So wherever you start in this cycle, it typically, there's a flow from listening to dialogue, and then through praxis, which is action, and that 5 should go right back to the 1, that reflection. And then the reflection actually continues the cycle. Now in this Freirean educational empowerment that was at the core, what they would do would be to listen to the life stories of those people and dialogue about what they had heard. This was a way of developing critical thinking skills, not to be frightened by those people scared straight, you know, if I take drugs, I'm going to end up like this guy. That is very ineffective. And then action, going from dialogue to action in terms of community, and then reflecting. Okay, the basis of ASAP were, as you see, Freire moving from being just vessels filled with teachers' knowledge to being actually co-learners versus, and also the Rogers protection motivation theory. Now I'm just going to ask you for about 10 seconds to just take a few seconds to remember what it was like to be 14 for you. Powerlessness, if you can remember that far back, and how whatever efforts were made to get you to behave, to reduce your risk, okay? To act the way your society wanted you to act. 10 seconds of reflection. Just reflect on it. We're all going to have a chance to converse.
I didn't say anything.
But you were definitely remembering.
I was remembering.
Okay. In the ASAP, Freire part was listening, dialogue, action, reflection, and the Roger part, protection, motivation. I'm doing my anaerobic thing. Now, in the inductive questioning guide, this is the SHOWED, and that's an acronym for seeing or naming the problem. You go through all these questions. What do we see? And when Sapphire was explaining this process, this kid was going through that process. What is going on in my life? This kid was extremely oppressed. I'm not going to ruin the story for you. It's fabulous. She was very oppressed and really very unquestioning, very blind. What do you see? Name this one. What's happening to this individual? What's happening to me? How does it relate to our lives? Now, when they were looking at those people that were living with drug problems and alcohol, whatever, they would say, what's happening to that person? How does it relate to me? Why has this person experienced these problems? Why do we face these problems? How might we become empowered? And the big E in SHOWED is the empowered word. To understand the collective nature of the problem. No individual has problems. Health problems are never one person's individual problem, okay? Health problems always have a collective nature, a structural nature. And if we miss that, we're basically just blaming the victim. It really is that important. And then the D is, I like the E and the D. Empowered and do. What can we do about these problems? This is where the praxis comes in the SHOWED. This again explains the listening dialogue praxis and how they were, the kids, how they were through this, and then how they go through the showed to arrive at behaviors that protect themselves and behaviors that protect others. The reactions to the dialogue that these kids would have with these people was, you know, this is horrible, it sucks, it could happen to me. When people have that realization, I know from your behavior class how important, you recall, I know that you know this, that you recall from your behavior classes, that feeling that I am not bulletproof. This could happen to me. Any of these things could happen to me. That feeling of vulnerability is key to healthy choices, okay? To any level of disease prevention work has to start with some element of this is horrible, and it could happen to me. That's for the protection motivation. And then the adaptive coping responses to acknowledge the feelings that you feel when you're encountering this, and then moving past those emotions while holding on to the empathy part, to a cognitive understanding of what's happening, thinking beyond peers and families. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, because I'm thinking about, so Freire adapted also, you know, that from Rogers adapted that from Freire.
Yeah, Rogers is not what ASAP did was to bring together Rogers' behavioral theory and Freire's conscientization theory. It's a very novel thing to bring those things together. Okay, now the questions, those sound like very superficial questions, but these questions would open the door to questions about what is wrong with this picture. People start actually thinking. That's the first step towards going, the next step to thinking, how would this look if this community was a really healthy community? If my life were promoting my health, what would this all look like? Okay, the ASAP students define their actions through presentations, peer teaching, organizing, community-based research, community murals. They actually moved from all of that experience of reflecting on what was going on to a praxis step, and then back to listening and reflecting. And they actually ended up with some very, very wonderful videos and fotonovelas, sort of commemorating their lives and their efforts to reach health and to try to influence statewide policy. It was a very moving and very successful step. Freire in Action emphasizes the importance of youth becoming advocates for their healthcare schools. It takes the emphasis off the individual, places individuals within their social and political context. Now, this thing is kind of lame. It's more important in Native American and Latino communities. There is a lot of effort to divide people and to pretend that people in Anglo communities do not feel this way. And they are far more isolated. I mean, we have ways of making people not be able to have community. Just the way our housing works, so that people hardly get to know their neighbors. But all human beings crave community. All human beings thrive on community, they need community. So this is a little bit artificial. It's much more visible in Native American and Latino communities, for sure. But all human beings need community. Okay, the outcomes, the three-stage model change. You better know, you better have read that because I'm not gonna go through this. ASAP actually inspired other strategies with the the challenges of getting youth to assume responsibility for organizing their own programs, and using, there were challenges in terms of funding for adolescent programs, using schools, because schools were very constrained places, still are. Now the Truth Campaign borrows some concepts from Frarian. Has anybody heard the Truth Campaign? It's a way of getting people conscientized about the way that cigarettes companies market their products and make them more addictive and all that stuff. So the Truth Campaign is about what is really happening when in the tobacco companies. And this, I don't know, did any of you get a chance to click on this video? It's awesome. It's a die-in, and it's just exactly like the act of die-ins, to try to make a visual image in people's heads of how many lives cigarette smoking takes. It's an interesting analogy, because the same way that people thought of AIDS as invisible until the die-in started, these things that the Truth Campaign did not only underscored how manipulative these companies were in promoting their addictive products and making them more addictive, but also the toll that it took. Okay, there's plenty of research to support that the Truth Campaign had significant short and long-term effects on adolescent smoking, attitudes and behaviors, and I just wanted to close with Paulo Freire's words. True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. And true generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, I want you to think of the microcredit concepts that we have had the opportunity to hear about, Granny and Kiva, as you hear Freire's words, because they are grounded in Freudian theory. So that these hands, whether of individual or entire people, may be extended less in supplication or begging, asking for things, so that more and more they become human hands, which work, and working transform the world. Those photographs there by Paulo Freire are photographs from the micro enterprises of women who were caregivers of children with HIV, or who themselves were living with HIV, and they made these micro enterprises with these small grants, and mind-blowing that there's no business. I know that none of you have heard that song, right? There's no business like show business. Has anyone? I've heard it. So you don't get it. But that's very funny, see? There's no business like people with AIDS owned and operated business. But while we get ready, I'm just going to put this away, and then I'm going to actually ask you, no, don't say those changes. I'm going to ask you to please make a circle really fast.
Is this when you're going to call Joyce?
Yes, we're going to call Joyce right now. And please, this is, I'm so sorry, but we can't do that right now. We are really pressed for time. Meanwhile, while I turn on the lights and I help you make a circle, and call Joyce. Did you call Joyce? I'm going to sing There's No Business.